today we do have Frank Herman, who's back. Frank is a founder and principal of LeanVista Incorporated. Frank is also a partner of ThoughtRock as our accredited ITIL training affiliated located in Denver, Colorado. He's formally trained in operations research, information systems engineering, Lean Six Sigma, program, and project management. Over his 30-year career, Frank has demonstrated proven success in generating business value by developing and managing high-performance global work teams and processes for both governmental entities and the Fortune 2000 across North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. Frank's a regular contributor to and a presenter with ThoughtRock, and we're excited to have him back. So I'll turn it over now to Frank. Frank.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak again to the ThoughtRock community. The title of our presentation today is Using Lean Six Sigma Process Improvement to Implement ITIL Service Delivery Best Practices. The basic premise is that if you're really planning to leverage the power of ITIL's service delivery best practices, what you're doing can be thought of as a series of process improvement projects. And one of the very best practices out there for process improvement is Lean Six Sigma. And so the premise here and what we're intending to do is to show you how you can leverage Lean Six Sigma to make your ITIL-based process enhancements the best that they can be. So there are three primary learnings that we're going to strive to get across today. One is learning the commonalities between Lean Six Sigma process improvement approaches and the ITIL Continual Service Improvement approach. Secondly, you'll learn about the numerous Lean Six Sigma agnostic process design, deployment, and measurement tools that can be used to provide enhanced control, justification, and expansion of your ITIL improvement projects. And you're going to learn how to design ways to piggyback or integrate your ITIL process improvement projects with existing or planned Lean Six Sigma process improvement projects from a program management perspective. The basic idea is that some shops are more of a Lean Six Sigma shop, other shops are more of an ITIL shop, but there's a great amount of sharing and benefit to be gained by cross-pollinating the two approaches, and that's what we're going to talk about. Of course, the legal disclosures, copyright here, copyright there, and moving on, we've talked about what you're going to learn today, so I'm just going to jump right to a quick overview. This is me, born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and sounds like it. And I've been told that I talk real fast, and considering all the slides I have to go through today, you'll be glad that I went through it, although I don't know if you'll understand it. I'll try to hit the right balance between covering the ground quickly and not skipping too much off of the content. The rest of this you heard from Rick, so I won't spend any more time on this, other than to say the last bullet point, 30 years of experience in implementing improvements to business processes, not just business processes, but technical processes, IT service management processes, and the interface between the two. So I always start off our presentation just to remind people what ITIL is, because not everyone that comes on board is really familiar with ITIL. And what it is it's a global best practice for IT service management. It's rooted in information technology, but it's really applicable to any kind of technology-enabled business process as well. And considering the Web 2.0 model that has proliferated across everything, in effect, business processes are technical processes and vice versa. A framework, it's a framework that basically identifies specific service management processes, their inputs, outputs, and integration points, but not the specific processes themselves. That's up to you. It goes down to a certain level, but it doesn't take it down to the very lowest level of detail. And it's also a framework that identifies how to manage process management of IT service management, kind of a meta, one step back. But it also means to unite an organization around a common vision. You can look at the framework and see the end state of a fully mature and robust organization utilizing all of these processes, and you can then turn around and say, well, where are we compared to that? And you can plot a course from here to there and examine ways to determine what's the best path to get there in terms of value contributions to your business and to your customers. And as we've talked about, it's a way to perform continual service improvement. And I put the word process in parentheses because service is delivered through process. Now, there are a lot of fine points that can be made all along the way that says, well, not exactly 100%, but I'm speaking to a larger point here, and we'll get into that as we go down the road here in the presentation. It's a common language adopted across the road. There are hundreds of thousands of companies across the world that have adopted ITIL. It's considered the best practice for IT and business service management, and it's a means for individual career growth and advancement. I know many people who have obtained ITIL certifications, and in doing so have made themselves more valuable to their company and thereby to themselves. This is the ITIL framework. Again, many of you have seen this, but for those who are new to ITIL, this is sort of the bedrock foundation graphic of what ITIL is about. And you'll see at the center of ITIL, I'm not sure if my mouse is coming across here when I move it, but here's service strategy. And service strategy is the core component of the framework that drives the what processes create the most value in the organization and determine how we're going to select which processes to work with. And then at that point we move to a service design component in the framework where we design new processes. These processes are then transitioned. There's a whole framework of processes about how to do appropriate transition of services. These services then are placed into operation. And as they go along, a continual service is the wrapper that goes around everything, with the idea that as we do things, we learn from them, and with our learnings, we want to turn them around and improve our processes from what we have learned. That's the whole picture of the ITIL framework. And today's talk is we're going to compare and contrast continual service improvement in ITIL with Lean Six Sigma. So I'm going to take you down a journey of talking about the ITIL side of it in terms of continual service improvement, and then we're going to go to the Lean Six Sigma view on process improvement. We're going to sort of compare them back and forth and talk about how we can leverage these approaches in common. So as we talked about, ITIL service strategy, that's what's driving strategy management for IT services. Pulling people together, understanding what creates value for the business. It manages the service portfolio, which is the basically the collection of processes that are either planned to be created, are in effect, or are retired. That's as expressed through the service catalog. And we're not going to go into deep dives into service strategy other than to the extent necessary to be able to tie back and forth between Lean Six Sigma and ITIL. But it also deals with demand management, business relationship management, and all of those components underneath ITIL service strategy end up driving out the concept of what is the most value contributing set of services that the business needs to adopt. ITIL service strategy uses perspectives, positions, plans, patterns, all of these components of ITIL service strategy drive the strategy for all process development and deployment rollout in an ITIL-centric archetype, if you will. And they use components and techniques that deal with patterns, asset types, archetypes, market spaces, all these buzzwords. They actually have really significant concepts behind them, but the end goal is to define high-value services for the customer. And the customer, the context of the customer is not IT necessarily. It's the business. Again, it's service management for technology-based services for the customer. So one of the things that strategy tries to do is it tries to provide for the creation of services that have high utility. Utility being expressed as performance, a means to characterize performance, the idea of improving the mean of performance. If we want to load baggage within 15 minutes, and here currently is the distribution of times that we use to load baggage, here's our mean, right? And if we want to improve that mean to this higher mean of performance, then here's the utility effect, the idea of if we use strategy to correctly identify what drives our processes, we can create and we can improve that utility. Not only do we talk about utility, but we also talk about warranty. the concept of optimizing the variation in performance. Now you may say, Frank, didn't you mean to say reduce the variation in performance? I picked optimize for a specific reason because there's a cost associated with variation of performance. And if it's all right to have a certain amount of variation in performance as judged by your customer's response to the variance, then that's doesn't mean you necessarily have to tighten it up. If you're serving chocolate chip cookies on the airplane and you accidentally give some customers 2 chocolate chip cookies, I don't see too many people canceling their frequent flyer card with your airline because they got an extra cookie. But if you're giving away an extra car at the time you deliver it, that's a cost you can't afford. You'll notice again this concept here. We're going to repeatedly come back to the concept. And I imagine virtually everybody on this call is familiar with the concept of a distribution curve that shows the sum of all of the results of a particular activity, with the idea that there's a mean that represents the average of the events that occur that are being measured. And then as you go out to either end, this is called going out to the tails. And the idea here is that this dotted line here represents an interval of control that usually is expressed in terms of a standard deviation. I'm not going to take everybody through Stats 101, but everything that happens both in terms of Lean Six Sigma and to a large degree as well in ITIL, the idea is understanding these curves in terms of the measurements of what's being produced, how is value expressed, and what is the variation in the delivery of these components. So for a moment now, let's go over to Lean Six Sigma. We talked about ITIL in terms of service strategy and its desire using those components to deliver high-value producing services. What about Lean Six Sigma? What is it? Well, first off, it's a synergy really between concepts that have been driven out from, well, if you want to go all the way back to Frederick Taylor and the Scientific Revolution back in 1800 something, you could take it all the way back there, but I'm just going to take you back as far as 2002 to Michael George, who was instrumental in coming up with the synergy between Lean, which was a different approach than Six Sigma, but having overlaps, and he pulled these together in a approach called Lean Six Sigma. And I'll be making mention to a book that you'll probably want to get your hands on if you don't already have it, called the Lean Six Sigma Pocket Toolbook. It basically takes my 4-year operations research degree and crams it into 278 pages. And if I'd have read that book, then I would have just skipped my undergrad, I guess, but not really. But the point is, it's aimed at combining techniques for eliminating defects in manufacturing process, which is where a lot of this came from, with improvements in eliminating waste from service processes as shown through Lean principles. Some of you may be familiar with the term the 7 wastes and the 4 principles. These are service concepts that are based on the idea of improving your process by doing things like eliminating delay on the part of customers who are waiting for service or for delivery, items not arriving as promised, duplication of data, unnecessary movement, unclear communications, or these 4 principles about work being highly specified as to content, sequence, timing, and outcome. Pathways must be simple and direct. All of these concepts merging together and focused on business process as opposed to being just focused on manufacturing disciplines. And all of it drives from the collection and analysis of metrics. So to foreshadow, using movie terminology here, you're going to see a lot of overlap between Lean Six Sigma and ITIL, because so much of what we do in ITIL as well is based on collection and analysis of metrics. We're going to talk about the different ways that we look at those metrics and do analysis between ITIL and Six Sigma as we move on down through the presentation. But the goal is to manage variation in process output and to drive defects per million opportunities down to 3.4, and that's Six Sigma. There's a table that I could bring up on the screen. I'm not going to, but it basically helps you understand, based on the opportunities you've got and how many defects you have, how much Sigma do you have in terms of accuracy and quality. This is driven by the voice of the customer. This is a term that isn't really used in ITIL so much, although conceptually they're all about the voice of the customer, but the terminology is different. And the basic ways that this voice of the customer, which is the strategic input from your business customer and your customers, then drives down to two primary methodologies to improve the processes. If you're an ITIL shop, then you're thinking about these two approaches. One is DMAIC, D-M-A-I-C, and one is DMADV. DMAIC is the process improvement approach, and DMADV, which is also called Design for Six Sigma, is the approach that you're using when you want to create processes from scratch that have never been there, and it's not an improvement situation, it's a brand new situation. And so what we're going to be doing as we go along here is we're going to compare and contrast DMAIC, Design for Six Sigma, and ITIL's Continual Service Approach. How do you select projects in Lean Six Sigma? How do you get to a sense of what should we work on and what shouldn't we work on? The basic concept is moving from strategy, the 5-year plan, down to the 1-year plan, utilizing concepts around voice of the business down to voice of the customer. And you're going to see this big overlap as we go along, that there are financial analysis techniques that are used that are almost identical really between the two in terms of how you ultimately get to the idea of what's going to create us more wealth for our shareholders, right? That's really what you're trying to do here. And so the idea is to start with a strategy and take it down to a 1-year tactical vision that enables you to understand what are the gaps in our customer needs versus what we're providing to them, to define what the critical requirements are for our processes. And I talked already about the concept of these 7 wastes and these 4 principles as just being guidelines that you get in suggestions as to generically how you would want to improve any process from a customer perspective. And there's a corollary in ITIL in terms of service archetypes and service plans and service packages. So both of these higher level methodologies, if you will, or philosophies, both supply you with some generic starting places that you can use to look at your processes. They don't necessarily provide you what you might think of as the breakthrough inductive kind of thinking that I think you all have probably by now heard the famous quote from Steve Jobs about why he never did market research. And he said, because I can tell you that no matter how many people I would have asked what they needed in their life, none of them would have said, I need a smartphone that's based on a Cocoa Smalltalk interface with a touch screen that links up to my Mac. So in the same way here, there's a somewhat of a deterministic or reductionistic, if that's a word, approach that is sort of the predominant guiding approach to both Lean Six Sigma and ITIL. However, having said that, when you think about basic blocking and tackling and how many companies don't do the basics even before they get to the point where let's invent a new iPhone, how about let's just return our customers' phone calls in a reasonable amount of time? Wouldn't that be worth something? So when you get into the project selection component of Lean Six Sigma, then ultimately you're coming down to a balance between either we're going to create new products or new processes, or we're going to improve processes that are already existing. And so depending on what your voice of the business and voice of the customer tell you, you may be designing things that are new, so you're going to be going down the design for Lean Six Sigma track for new things, or you're going to be improving existing processes because you're at that point where really you just have to do what you're doing better because you've already got a sustainable competitive advantage of some type. I won't belabor the voice of the customer other than to say that the goal is to provide best-in-class service or quality of product, and there's many ways to do it. You deal with the concepts of stated needs versus unstated needs, going back to this Stephen Jobs concept. But it's really used to drive out specific measures of quality. And this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the life of this presentation, is the idea of moving through a series of steps that take you from abstractions down to concrete levels of measurement so that you can then tell how you're doing and examine the data that you collect to tell you where you're missing the ball, and then figure out ways to tighten up the approach and prove both to yourself and your customers that you are doing it right. And so all of this is I created to get you to the point of having hard data to give you the picture of what you should be doing. So we talked about design for Six Sigma, DMADV. This is the approach that they use for new process development, where you're defining opportunities to address that you haven't been dealing with before, and then measuring customer needs in whatever context is appropriate based on the way that the customer is looking at what creates value for them. And then moving through a design concept analysis and detailed design phases in the same way, not unlike any kind of systems development process where you're going through analysis to determine what are the requirements, and then a design to turn around and define how you're going to actually do it from a physical perspective, and then in this final step of verifying a detailed design. Of course, that detailed design is a process in the context of Lean Six Sigma, but when you think again about the notion of how processes are instantiated in the Web 2.0 world, I should probably stop saying Web 2.0, it's so dated at this point. We're probably up to Web 3.0 and I just didn't get the email. But the basic idea is all of these processes are going to ultimately be instantiated in some kind of web delivery model, because that's how the world works at this point. So here is the famous defect distribution chart that is absolutely centric to what Lean and Six Sigma are about. Now you notice that there's a high degree of conformance with this chart to the earlier charts we saw about process utility and process warranty from the ITIL service strategy perspective. So you see again overlaps, commonalities as we go down the line. And the term Six Sigma, when you really think about what does that mean? Well, it means if you had 1 million opportunities to provide service, that you would only have 3.4 defects per million. And this is 6 standard deviations out. So 6 standard deviations on the plus side, 6 negative standard deviations across that limit, then that's what it takes you to get to a 99.97. Now, when I was in statistics, I always remembered 2 standard deviations because that was 99.5%, and I thought that was, no one would ever want to go past 99.5%. But when you're dealing with millions and millions of things, guess what? It's not good enough. And that's really what this is. And so you're going to see this over and over again in our approaches. But you know what? There are still other means by which processes can be driven besides even ITIL or Six Sigma. I think that perhaps many of you, probably all of you, have heard of the concept of the balanced scorecard. The balanced scorecard is still another business strategy approach that takes a look at an organization from 4 primary perspectives: the financial perspective, learning and growth, internal business process development, maintenance and improvement, and finance. And so maybe your shop isn't really doing much of ITIL, and maybe it's not even doing much of Lean Six Sigma, but perhaps what it's doing is driving from balanced scorecard, in which case what's happening then is that scorecard is then decomposing to some kind of program of work, and so you're probably doing program management and portfolio management, in which you're doing analysis of the various projects that are driven out from the program that are building in the functional capabilities that represent the strategic positioning that you have to put yourself in, whether it's access-based strategies, whether it's variety-based strategies, whatever your strategic approach is. But again, you're getting back to the idea of projects that Many of them have internal business process implications. In fact, they all will eventually. They'll either be processes that are internal to your operation, or they'll be customer-facing processes. And so, again, and then this ends up in what you might think of as a benefits realization phase or analysis to confirm that, yes, we did drive these to completion in our program and project management approach, and that the benefits that we thought would accrue did in fact accrue, and so we're hitting our targets, we're doing what we need to do. So as you can see, there's a huge overlap just even at the start, at the upper end of the funnel, where we're driving from strategy down to programs of work, but down to projects that represent processes, either new process creation or process improvement. So let's take a moment and contrast these different process improvement approaches. We're going to move into the realm of talking about improving existing processes as opposed to creating new processes from scratch, because that's the tenor, or that's the basic idea that we're talking about here in our presentation today, is process improvement approaches, compare and contrast between Lean Six Sigma and ITIL as opposed to new process creation. Although you can see there are facilities in both, right? So the ITIL Continual Service Improvement model, let's talk about that. I think you remember from the original diagram that I showed you of the ITIL framework that there was a circle around all of the ITIL framework that was called Continual Service Improvement. And that's what we're talking about now. We're going to talk about the model and actually the process of how that is done in ITIL. And then after we do that, we're going to talk about how that's done in Lean Six Sigma. We've already foreshadowed that a little bit. You can tell that the Oscars and the SAG Awards are on. I'm talking movie metaphors for some strange reason. But anyway, the Continual Service Improvement model is based upon vision and goals as the first step. What are, how do we vision as a verb, right? Where do we want to be? There's a lot of different ways that you can get there, but the basic idea is to say, where do we want to be? Where are we now? We are here. We want to be there. How do we get there? Did we get there? And how do we keep the momentum going if we're able to get that momentum going? This is a very, you may turn around and say, well, Frank, this is just kind of generic common sense. But you know what makes it common sense is when something works and works and works, it becomes common because everybody knows that it works. And this model is the basis behind the process of continual service improvement. So the next slide here, we talk about the actual process. And so in the continual service improvement process, remember what we have going in. We have a clear understanding of strategy. We have a clear understanding of what creates value for our shareholders and our customers. We understand the order that we're doing things, and we finally looked at this whole array of processes, and we've selected a candidate process. And this process that we're looking at is the mother of all processes. If we get this process right from a sensitivity analysis point of view, it is going to do more than improving any other single process. Now, maybe you have enough money to work on more than one process. Well, then maybe you're working on number 2 or number 3 because your boss is more politically savvy than their boss, or not as much. But either way, you're dealing with a hugely sensitive process, and you know it. So what you're now trying to understand is when you look at this process, you're holding this process up in the air, and you're looking at it and you're saying, what is the determination of value from this process? What does it kick out that's value? What should we be measuring on this process? What can we measure? What's the variation of the process? How do defects manifest itself? How does successful completion of the process manifests itself? What is it that's coming out of this thing that we can grab a hold to? What's the data exhaust? How do we gather the data and get our hands on it? How do we know the veracity of the data? So this is what you're going through in the continual service improvement process. And so now you're actually collecting this data, you're processing it. Perhaps you have some kind of really good approach, like, or let's say an application system that's web-facing, maybe some kind of system. Oh, pick it, any one you want. But the idea is that the system is doing more than just delivering the process, it's also throwing off stats and data that you can then get a hold of. And so in the continual service process, and here's the big overlap between the two, analyzing data. And this is where I think that the payback for this presentation is going to start to really raise its head now, because I realize we've kind of been setting the table, waiting to actually get the meal served here. And this is where this is going to start to happen, because it's in the analysis of the data that the truth is going to come out from everything that you've got that tells you what's really going on here and what can we do to change it. And there's a difference in emphasis in data analysis between ITIL and Lean Six Sigma. And what I'm going to say, I'm going to throw this out, and I'm willing to take somewhat of a controversial stance here, that Lean Six Sigma statistical techniques are more mature, and there's more emphasis in Lean Six Sigma on analyzing data. That's not to say that ITIL doesn't want you to do that and doesn't provide you with the means to approach how you're going to do that. But I'll cover that more when we get to Lean Six Sigma. But the concept, again, analyze the data and then present and use the information. I don't know how many times I've seen people exhibit what are called one of the 5 hazardous attitudes of pilots. I'm a pilot, and one of the things that they teach you are hazardous mental models that can impede your ability to be successful as a pilot. And one of those 5 hazardous attitudes is the concept of resignation. And in the pilot lingo, resignation is you see a situation coming, but you've decided there's nothing you can do about it, and so you're not even going to try. It's just your fate. Spinning, stalling down, may as well just start praying because there's just nothing I can do about it. Well, my father, if you find yourself sliding into a brick wall at 80 miles an hour and there's no way to avoid hitting the wall, hit the brakes anyway. And so you have a lot of situations where you'll get data and people will present it, but they won't use the data. So it's incredibly critical to then take that data and implement corrective action. And so this is a tenet of ITIL, and it's also a tenet of Lean Six Sigma. So in Lean Six Sigma, the operative approach for the improvement of your processes is DMADV, and DMADV is an acronym for Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, and Control. And the idea here is when you're defining is that you are defining what the project is, what the problem statement is. You're validating the voice of the customer and the voice of the business. You're validating what these financial benefits are. You're looking at your process maps and your streams. You're getting your team together. You're developing a schedule. You're defining what this effort's going to be. When you move on to the measurement phase, you are identifying key inputs, key outputs, processes. You're developing your operational definitions. You're validating your measurement systems. You're putting together a data collection plan. You're collecting your baseline data. And you're basically creating gates to help you understand measurement gates so that you can understand if you're hitting your points along the way. And then analysis. You're basically determining what those critical inputs and potential root causes are that are causing problems. You're reducing that list of potential root causes. You're confirming a root cause effect on the output, etc. And then the improvement step. You're developing the potential solutions. You're evaluating, you're selecting and optimizing the best solutions. You're looking at your 2B process maps. You're developing plans for a pilot solution, etc. And then finally, you're controlling it. You're implementing what you might think of as mistake proofing. You're developing standard operating procedures. You've got a training plan you're putting into place. You're implementing process controls and measurements. So the basic idea is you're going through this. Now, how do you do this? Well, you do this with your project team, and you have a couple of different approaches in Lean Six Sigma. And for those of the people who are on the call that have a deep and rich Lean Six Sigma background, I hope you're not disappointed that I'm not going to go into a deep and long discussion of project team organization approaches, whether you treat it as a project approach where you're staffing it up with a full team of belts, or whether or not you're using a very focused one-week Kaizen kind of an approach. But the basic idea is that if you're using this approach, you've got to get your team together, and you've got a couple of options about how far and how deep you want to take this depending on the nature of the depth and breadth of the problem. If it's a cross-enterprise solution, or let's call it a cross-enterprise opportunity or problem, well, you've got a lot of ground to cover it, so you may need to have a very expansive project team to cover it. If it's a very focused, very simple, it may be simple problem, simple solution, but it may have a profound effect, then you may be using more of a Kaizen approach. So now we're at the intersection. We're now at the intersection of Lean Six Sigma and ITIL. And this is where we wanted to get to in our presentation. And basically, think of it as two large paths. One path is new process development. The other path is process improvement. We talked about in ITIL how you use service strategy and service design to create and design what these new approaches or these new processes are going to be, technology or business processes that are enabled by technology. In Lean Six Sigma, it's the design for Six Sigma, also known as DMADV. In the process improvement arena, what we're looking at is ITIL's Continual Service Improvement approach versus Lean Six Sigma's DMAIC approach, which we just talked about. Now, this is where you start to see somewhat of a divergence between the two in terms of ITIL and Lean Six Sigma. I'm going to go into this now. First off, it's really important to understand that it's all about measurements. And this is one of the commonalities between the two. I accidentally jumped a little bit ahead here. I have one more commonality slide to talk about before I start diving down more deeply into Lean Six Sigma. It's all about measurements. And so what do you have coming from above? Well, you've got strategy. And strategy is giving you critical success factors. What's the measurement? Are we hitting it or not? Kind of binary. Key performance indicators. These can be key performance indicators that are indicative of whether or not we are hitting a goal, as opposed to whether or not we are doing the right thing that will enable us to then hit a goal that will give us a different kind of key performance indicator. Both approaches use process dashboards of some kind, and how deep and how far you take them is determining, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Defects, that's something that's much more the province of Lean Six Sigma thinking. I think that anyone on here who's an ITIL person will basically say, no, we do that too, we do that too. But I think you're going to see as we go a little bit farther along here that there's more of a focus on a defect identification, variation analysis in Lean Six Sigma. Although all those tools are available to ITIL, and that's really kind of the point of this presentation today, is to make you aware that these are available and you should be using them when it makes sense. So when we talk about ITIL, the focus is more generally on the improvement of warranty and utility of a process. And so you may say, well, hey, that's true for Lean Six Sigma. But I think when you go through the body of knowledge, you just see that in general, ITIL is more focused on the idea of performing or creating the very best kinds of service packages and services for the business that provide the most warranty and utility, whereas Lean Six Sigma probably has more of a preponderance on eliminating the defects and getting to that Six Sigma level of performance. Now, the Six Sigma people may be saying, well, don't forget design for Six Sigma. We, too, also want to improve warranty and utility. So I do understand that you can stand in either camp and make the argument that you're doing everything that the other camp might be thinking that you're not. They're really trying to get to the same thing. But here's a kind of a point that I really do want to make, is that Lean Six Sigma just has a reliance on more statistical analytical techniques as it being sort of imbued or embodied in the approach. Let's talk about some of those tools. And this is a really dense slide, and I apologize for throwing this at you. What I'm trying to do now is I am trying to summarize 300 or 400 easily different kinds of techniques and measures that into about 8 or 9 categories that would help you get some insight into what the nature of these hundreds of different measurements and techniques for measurements of variance or compliance or divergence, with the idea that when you look at this slide, when you go back and you look at this slide, if you think in terms of these bullet points as being the starting place to go back then and learn more about them, you'll see, for instance, that there's 30 or 40 data collection techniques. There's dozens of descriptive statistics and data displays, etc. You're going to have to do that research. We can't cover it in 45 minutes, right? But this is to get you pointed at that. And I'm going to again mention this book, Lean Six Sigma Pocket Toolbook, as being just an awesome, awesome book. It was one of the foundations of my epidemiology and statistics course in my master's at the University of Colorado, and it's a great way to sort of cram 4 years of statistics into one book. But you need to understand that you've got to be looking at the following as categories: value stream mapping and process flow tools. You have to be able to understand where things are going from entity to entity. Data collection, you have to understand how to get your hands on the data. You need to have statistics and data displays that help you understand about the distribution and property of data sets. You've got to learn all about data sets analysis. You've got to be able to provide techniques to understand analysis of variation. Why are we varying and how? And that is then what goes down to identification and verifying causes. There are many, dozens of techniques to help you understand how to get to true root cause analysis that then can be targeted for improvement and verifying that you have the right root cause. You need to understand the various techniques to eliminate these constraints in the process and reduce lead time and cost. Cost is always critical. Now you may say, Frank, all these things that you're telling me that I need to learn about, I thought I was going to learn about in this seminar, and I apologize that I just can't go through literally the hundreds of different techniques here. I feel a little bit like bait and switch here, but really I want to just get you tuned into the fact that there are these things, and I've given you reference to a place where you can find this. But you don't see the emphasis on these things as much in the ITIL world, although they are available to ITIL, and people who have a background in both will use these to support ITIL Continual Service Process, and you can too. So the goal here is you're trying to quantify and diagnose these complex opportunities and get to the point of creating the highest and best value process. And you need to be able to test these solutions. You need to be able to figure out the way to prove and implement these things. So as again I mentioned, there's hundreds of these kinds of things in Lean Six Sigma, and it's even probably inappropriate to even say that they're Lean Six Sigma techniques, right? Because these techniques came along in statistical analysis long before anyone even used the term Six Sigma or the term Lean. So I don't want to turn around and say, well, hey, only Lean Six Sigma is the one that can do this, or these are their techniques. So how do we leverage this? How do we leverage, if you're in a world with Lean Six Sigma and ITIL, how can you leverage this so that you are, if you're in a Lean Six Sigma shop and you want to try to leverage the zeitgeist there to get your ITIL projects going, how do you do that? Or vice versa? Well, that's going to drive originally or immediately from understanding the alignment of the ITIL service catalog and service portfolio with the voice of the customer as defined in Lean Six Sigma. You've got to understand the alignment between the projects that you personally are trying to bring forward and be able to articulate that. And if there is no clear alignment, I mean, why not? Just answering this question right here, if you get nothing else from this presentation, just to be able to turn around and say, why do I think my ITIL process projects are important and nobody else does? What's going on? Why can't I get any traction on this? Well, now you start to understand that you haven't really clued in to the voice of the customer and what generates value. It's really important that you are aligned in terms of your measurements, in terms of what you're collecting and reporting on between ITIL, utility and warranty, and what kinds of measurements are coming out from your Lean Six Sigma, especially from the design from Six Sigma as driven from strategy. Again, at the big level, it's alignment of strategy. At the smaller level, though, it's about making sure that you're speaking with the right measures that people can understand. And maybe it's defects. Maybe the fact is you're not thinking defects, but the Lean Six Sigma people are in a stream of defect reduction processes or projects and if you take another look at your projects from that perspective, you might be able to get more traction on that. It's really important that your ITIL projects, your ITIL Continual Service Process Improvement projects are aligned with either the balanced scorecard measures we talked about earlier, or portfolio management's perspectives from your program management team, or from your design for Six Sigma. You may need to introduce new measures that are driven from Lean Six Sigma statistical measures. And again, I know they didn't invent them all, but the point is that they really emphasize them. And particularly with the cost of variation as a measurement. This is a really important thing that drives people's attention span. The cost of variation. If you have a high cost of if you have a high variation, but it doesn't cost you in terms of negativity, it's kind of a poor construction of words here. But what I'm trying to say, if a lot of variation doesn't really hurt you, then why spend the money to reduce variation? But on the other hand, if variation is hitting you hard and you can express that cost in a way, perhaps you aren't doing that with your continual service improvement initiatives that you're trying to get up the ladder through the ITIL side, maybe you need to get that cost of variation as a critical variable in front of people. It's really important to align your reporting dashboards and to your measurement platforms. If the Lean Six Sigma side of the house is all on one set of measurements and dashboard reporting system, and that has proliferated across the company, and you're not using the same reporting dashboard approach or same measurement platforms, get with the program. If they're driving the house, then, as they say, get with the program and adopt the same platform, and that will make it easier for you to communicate and to get your measurements in front of the right people who may already have those other dashboard systems in front of them, but not yours. And finally, no matter what side of the house you're on, if the other side is running the show, adopt the lingo, learn the language, understand the team. I mean, there are people that are in the ITIL side of the house that don't even know. So this is 7 or 8 highly, they're very high level, right? But they also are really important, and any single one of these things could break loose the kind of management support you need to get your initiative going forward. So in summary, we talk continual service improvement approach, albeit very high level, but you see now what these commonalities are. You've learned about these various Lean Six Sigma agnostic process design, deployment, and measurement tools. And I say agnostic because they're not driven from necessarily ITIL perspective, but just generic statistical analysis techniques that we've talked about, and how they can be used to provide some enhanced control and justification of your ITIL improvement projects. And we talked a little bit now about how to design ways to piggyback or integrate your ITIL process improvement projects with existing or planned Lean Six Sigma process improvement projects, and from a program management perspective, going back to the idea of what's creating value. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm about 5 minutes over. I'm going to throw it back to Rick at this point to take questions.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. So first question comes, the notion of process-centric is pervasive in this presentation. I thought ITIL presented a different model with services, not processes at the core. Processes exist to support services. Improvements to processes are performed to improve the value proposition services provide to customers. Did I miss something?
No, you absolutely got it right. But the overlay that I put on top of that and tried to make the point was that a service is delivered through a process. And so if you think of a process as a service, then it gives you an additional dimension to think about how to improve the service by looking at it through the lens of process improvement. And so by combining the benefits of both the process improvement side on the Lean Six Sigma with the service management approach in terms of value generation from ITIL, you now have an extra way to sort of bulwark the design and delivery of that service. Next question.
Excellent. Next question. For an organization that has low process maturity and wants to get started quickly without great overhead, which approach makes best sense? And then the separate but related question: does a particular methodology make more sense based on industry, sector, or nature of the business processes?
So let me address the first one, then I'll ask you to repeat the second one.
Sure.
The process maturity or organizational maturity of an entity, as defined maybe by the what used to be called the SCI capability maturity model, or other similar techniques, sort of takes you into the aphorism, or if you will, the old saying about we're going to take what they give us. And so in a perfect world, you would love to implement things in a top-down kind of an approach that give you the best chance to sort of do the quote-unquote right way. But what we've all learned from hard-fought experience is this concept of the low-hanging fruit, right? And that's the pain that is the most in your face, in your side. It's the screaming customer who has the biggest budget. It's the customer that's threatening to leave you, that contributes more money than any other thing, and it turns out that the one thing that drives them is the fact that they can't get a service ticket turned around in 4 hours for high priority, right? So these are the things which are maddening in the context of saying, oh, if I wasn't dealing with these alligators, I'd be able to drain the swamp. But on the other hand, they're a wondrous way to get a foothold to be able to get anything done that can then be grown on the basis of success. So trouble tickets, when you're looking in terms of ITIL and IT service management, frequently the place to start is customers who have problems that aren't getting their problems handled quick enough, can't get a desktop provision, can't get a user login, can't get a password reset. Very mundane, very prosaic, very maddening for a user. Certainly not glamorous like, geez, wouldn't it be nice if we could have our system automatically order inventory for our customers in a vendor-managed inventory situation, much more sophisticated and mature, maybe create much more value, but not in sync with the maturity of the organization. I hope, can you repeat the second part of the question, Rick?
Sure. The second part was, does a particular methodology make more sense based on industry, sector, or nature of business processes?
I'd say yes. Manufacturing environments have a much, they've started many of them on total quality management, ISO 9000, defect analysis, Lean Six Sigma. So manufacturing enterprises in general have had a leg up in the Lean Six Sigma world first, then ITIL. So I would say if you're making things where its defects are where there's some kind of approach in place to measure and manage and capture defects, then that's a natural lead into Lean and Six Sigma. But if, on the other hand, if you're in an organization that isn't really making things, but what they're doing is technology-aided process support, then that is an area that would be more leaning towards ITIL.
Okay, great. And a quick question on the name of the book that you suggested on the slide summary of LSS analytical tools. What was the name of the book?
It's called the Lean Six Sigma Pocket Tool Book.
Okay, fantastic. And one other, just a couple people have asked the question, and the slides are available in the ThoughtRock library for the members to log in and have access to the slide deck. So just in case anybody else had that same question. But I think we've covered most of the questions here, Frank. And again, if you, from a contact perspective, you can reach out. If you have any other questions, please reach out and talk to Frank directly. We do encourage that, and if anything does come through info@thoughtrock.com, we'll forward it directly to Frank as well. We appreciate everybody hanging in there, and great learning session today, Frank, as usual, so we appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have you back again.
Thank you.
And for those of you that are just for a reminder for next week, it's Tuesday, February the 5th, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, we have Pete McGarahan back with Pete Talks and building a star performer customer service team. So hope to see some of you back then. Appreciate everybody hanging with us for almost a full hour today. And again, great content, great learning outcomes, Frank. And if there's any other questions that come through to us, we'll make sure that they get over to you. So thanks again, Frank.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye now.